started here, Central Time. Thanks everyone for joining and welcome to the Mental Health Webinar Series. I'm Megan Dotson, the Program Manager. We have Sean Bear and Ray Daw presenting on Healing the Returning Warriors, Keys to Understanding Unique Challenges and Strengths of American Indian Alaska Native Veterans. This is the third in our series, which will be continuing over the next 2 months. All of our webinars are recorded, so if you ever miss a session, you can always go back and view it at a later date. So the training series is brought to you by the National American Indian and Alaska Native Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, and we are part of the MHTTC network, which also includes these 10 regional centers that you'll see here on the map, a network coordinating office, and the National Hispanic and Latino MHTTC. The project is supported by SAMHSA, and the presentation and the opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of SAMHSA, HHS, or the American Indian Alaska Native MHTTC. In the next couple of days, we're going to send out a follow-up email to everyone who attended, which includes a link to the recording, the handouts of the slides, any CEU request forms. Our center is a NADAC certified educational provider, and we'll be happy to provide you with CEUs for a $15 fee. Immediately following today's webinar, you'll be redirected to our GIPRA evaluation. This survey takes just a few minutes to complete and master satisfaction with the event that we're doing. The feedback is crucial for our future work, and we value your opinion, so we greatly appreciate your time and sharing your thoughts with us. You will be muted for the duration of this webinar, but please feel free to use the chat pod to share your questions and comments, and we'll try and address questions at appropriate points during the presentation or at the end. We have extra time today, so it should work out fine. Our speaker today that will go first is Ray Daw, or maybe it'll be Sean, I don't know what they keep calling yet, a member of our council. Mr. Daw is one of our major consultants, and Ray has been in the behavioral health field for about 35 years, working with the Navajo Nation, nonprofits, and most recently in Alaska. Work in behavioral health has been heavily geared towards developing native trauma-appropriate approaches that are healing and effective in tribal behavioral health prevention, intervention, and treatment services. So, we also have Sean Bear, the co-director of our MHTTC. Mr. Bear has been working as an administrator counselor in EAP, as a counselor in adolescent behavioral disorder programs, substance use, and in-home family therapy. He's been experienced in building holistic Native American-based curriculums and implementing these curricula and programs in substance use treatment and prevention programs. He is also an Army veteran of 9 years and was honorably discharged from the 82nd Airborne. So thanks so much for both of you to join us, and if you want to take over, Ray or Sean, feel free. Thank you.
So I guess right here, with the Native Veteran Curriculum, Healing the Returning. So this section here is, part of it is for treatment, an assessment, and some of the approaches need to be kind of taken into account when we work with Native veterans. Okay, Module 3, the objectives, Acculturation Assessments, DSM-5 Diagnostic Criteria for PSD, treatment of PSD, inclusion of family and community. Okay, the purpose, review the process involved in figuring out what problem or problem Okay, so as we know, it's like treatment. There should always we need to ensure that we're assessing the client's thoughts, feelings, and emotions. These should also be taken into account and making sure that they're considered paramount. Taken from the client's point of view, a little okay, how's that? A little bit better? Okay. Okay, so involved with this is micro-counseling skills. We need to be able to look at both verbal and nonverbal language. With Native Americans, it's a lot of times they really look at the body movements and eyes, everything that's kind of going along with what's going on. If you look at people with trauma, a lot of them are really sensitive to what's going on, and they're always looking for movements. They're always looking for different kind of things that might give them an idea that something might be wrong or something might happen. So, and part of this is to also make a crisis plan with your patients and rehearse them. You need to be able to plan ahead what's going on in their life, what can go on later that might cause more issues. Okay, so with the assessment, sometimes the words, the beliefs, and knowledge may need to be altered a bit. If you look at what has been going on in the past, some people's knowledge or belief systems may have been lost sometimes. It may lead some member to think that someone with a mental health diagnosis to be stigmatized. Now, this might actually come from the tribe itself, because if they're not all involved or have knowledge of the traditions, the spiritual components, and the medicines and stuff, they might think of this as also a mental health disorder, when it may not be. Then realizing also that from the medical point of view or spiritual point of view, some things can stem from innate gifts of sight, ability to speak to spirits or nature or foresee. We're not saying in all cases that this is the way it is, but we need to be able to look at each case individually and to be able to assess that as well through the culture. Long ago, this would have been detected by medical peoples as these young people came to age, but with a lot of things that's happened through our spirituality, our belief systems, or religions, they might put it, and trying to stop that, for about 100 years, it became illegal. That have been lost. So we also need to consider that along this kind of natives are in a spectrum. They need to look at it from an individual point of view, because there are so many differences. Okay, so look at acculturation assessments. We need to look at cultural identity from the client's point of view, whether they're traditional, bicultural, or acculturated or assimilated. It gives the patient a chance to decide on whether they practice one or the other. We cannot assume that because someone is native that they know or even practice native ways. An acculturated or assimilated native may want nothing to do with native traditions, just as a traditional native may prefer a native adapted version of treatment. So we need to be able to kind of look at those and realize that they're all a little bit different, and to take their kind of point of view and preferences into consideration. Okay, so we look at the trauma assessment. So we're looking at trauma exposure. We're looking at trauma through the lifetime, through the lifespan, and the number of occurrences, or to what extent these might have been. Because normally the more they have, the stronger these are, in their lifetime, they have a higher chance of developing PTSD. Also within this, we need to making sure we're always kind of assessing suicidality. So this is a serious thing to keep an eye on. I have always assessed for such and prepared clients for issues outside of treatment. We're not always going to be there. And instead of having them to think about what they can do on the spot, if you practice with them, give them those tools that they can work with, they can do that on their own when they need to. Plus, it allows them some planning on how to calm themselves, control anger, help them overcoming their own fears and worries. But we also need to look at warning signs, which may be changes in behavior. They could be getting worse, there could be a stressful event happen, or all of a sudden, the client may be saying everything is fine or will be soon. We need to be able to look at that as well because they may be happy during that time. Ray, would you like to take this?
Okay. At the second objective, we look at the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for PTSD. Of course, when working within the mental health field, the DSM is the Bible or the go-to for everyone for making diagnoses for PTSD. That's where the diagnosis of PTSD is embedded in. So we're going to go through these criteria really quick and show how they look. For PTSD assessment, a couple of things we were aware is that Native American veterans with combat-related PTSD tend to have it more severely than non-combat-related PTSD, and that's naturally due to the violence and deaths that occur in combat. But there's articles about this, and also Native American veterans are less likely to seek treatment after leaving the military. Much of that is likely due to the fact that many veterans are from very rural areas and don't have ready access to mental health care, particularly with the Veterans Administration. Race of PTSD by ethnicity, for example, shows that Native American veterans have a higher prevalence than white veterans, and some of that might be related to higher exposures of trauma through early adulthood and childhood. So those are a couple of things that we are aware of. The context of symptoms. When doing screening questions, it's important to do screening questions that are sensitive to American, Indian, Alaska Native veterans in terms of their upbringing and the culture. Cultural implications are really important to consider, and it is not unusual for Native culture to be misinterpreted or interpreted incorrectly, and that can result in label of Native American veterans, especially with mental illnesses that may not be the case. According to Marx and Gutner in 2015, the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, there's a change in how the diagnostic criteria for PTSD were described from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5, and we're going to go show you some of the DSM-5 criteria. So the DSM-5, of course, comes through the American Psychiatric Association, and there are several things that need to be looked at. One is that there is to be actual exposure or threat of death, serious injury, or sexual violence, and there are 4 ways that that exposure can be identified. Another criteria, B, states that it's important to look for one or more of the following symptoms associated with those traumatic events that are discussed in criteria A. And there are 5 areas there. The traumatic events can be recurring, as involuntary and intrusive, and that there are recurring dreams that are associated with the traumatic events, that there are dissociative reactions like flashbacks, and we hear that from people who are affected with severe and serious PTSD. There are a good amount of distress that occurs from exposure to the trauma, and there are some significant psychological reactions that occur to internal or external cues that might resemble or symbolize that traumatic event. Criteria, or criteria C, talks about the persistent avoidance of stimuli. People with PTSD will tend to adopt behaviors that keep them away from things or events that may trigger in PTSD responses, like kind of described in B. So these are a couple of things to look out for in criteria C. The fourth criteria, or criteria B, talks about the all negative alterations that occur in thinking and mood. Go back a little bit. Somehow I got moved up real quick. And the fifth criteria, criteria D-E, talks about alterations in arousal or reactivities. One of the more common arousal reactions we hear for PTSD in veterans is when a sharp noise occurs that can be taken for like a gunshot or a blast. And those cause reactions that from the PTSD. They can be irritable behavior, angry outbursts, reckless behavior. Hypervigilance is real common. We know that. And startled responses like the kind of described with gunshots or bangs. A lot of veterans don't appreciate fireworks, for example. I have 3 other criteria that are important to identify. There's duration of the disturbance. It has to be more than a month. The disturbance causes clinical distress across different parts of a lifespan. And that the disturbance can not be attributed to or explained through other psychological effects. And finally, it's important when diagnosing PTSD to specify whether those symptoms might, the dissociative symptoms are important to describe. And depersonalization, derealization are 2 parts of that are important to assess during an interview or when moving towards making a diagnosis. The third objective that we're going to look at is around how PTSD is treated, treatment of PTSD. Maybe from here.
Are you asking me? Okay. Okay, so treatment approach. You have to remember again, each person is an individual with unique preferences and self-identification. Remember not to stereotype natives, as there are many different tribes and self-preferences. So we need to see the patient in the present. There is no pan-Indian way of beliefs. We need to remember there's 573 tribes with many languages, practices, and beliefs. Not only this, but traditional, bicultural, and either acculturated or assimilated peoples. And many times, it can be even all in one tribe. So we need to be able to take a look at that. Not all the tribes or the families are going to be the same on each tribe. Okay, we prefer to use a strength model. This is in line with SAMHSA, the recovery model. Have the patient identify their strength. Do not discount them simply because it's not typical or normalized in a society. For example, a patient may identify companionship with animals as a strength. This is something that is beneficial to him or her and may be important to their recovery. In many cultures, nature has been a main avenue of reaching freedom or even enlightenment. This too is a part of traditional values such as seeking a vision during fasting or fasting ceremonies. But when beginning should be done and help with a traditional trained person. So the treatment of PTSD, remember that PTSD is highly treatable and possible to overcome. Although it may require several differences with the treatment pieces, treatment can include psychotherapy, psychopharmacology, and traditional healing approaches can be done. First, evidence-based practices or approaches will be reviewed, and then potential treatments available from American and Alaska Native cultures that your patient may identify with. Traditional healing should be done with respect to different tribal practices and preferably done by spiritual leaders or medicine people. So when we're looking at some of these things with PTSD, we're mentioning about the different tribes and their practices. We need to remember that not all the tribes are the same. The belief systems are not always the same. I know that I ran into some people not too long ago, is that because where I am, people would come to me and say, hey, this problem is going on. They're going to diagnose me with this or that, and so what can I do? So I might go talk to the doctor, psychiatrist, a mental health person, and ask them about this, of course with the client. And I said, well, have you taken this into account? You need to remember that even though you work with one tribe, it doesn't mean you know the answers to another tribe because they're so different. Plus, even within a tribe, the families might be different. The individuals might be different. The clan systems might be different and have different ceremonies in their belief systems. So we need to kind of remember those kind of things. Cognitive approaches. Cognitive approaches in cognitive restructuring may assist in helping a patient change the way they think of people, places, things, or events. This helps them change their belief systems or schemas they have of certain events. Remember that some of those may play a part in difficulties that they may be having in the present. So taking them back through there, looking at what brought on certain kind of emotions or fear or whatever it might be, is we need to also look at what we're thinking, because our thinking usually precedes our emotions and our behaviors. Okay, psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral psychotherapy encompasses a variety of techniques, including psychoeducation, anxiety management, exposure-based and cognitive restructuring. We also need to look at the exposure-based treatment. So sometimes these, if they're having a fear of something, first they might see, let's say for instance somebody's afraid of snakes or mice or something, they might put this animal in a cage far away from the room. That person begins to become used to that, and maybe in with their treatment or their counseling, each time later on as it goes on, they're putting this cage closer and closer. So eventually it might be right in front of them. Of course they learn to say, oh, that ain't going to get out, it's not going to bother me. But then sometimes it may lead to actually touching it, holding it. And over time they kind of lose that fear of that. So that's kind of like an example of that. They also have EMDR, eye movement desensitization, and reprocessing. So this normally the light goes back and forth. But we've also seen one native person adapt this a little bit. And what he had done was, instead of using a light or maybe a pen or something, he utilized a red-tailed hawk feather. So he would take this and go back and forth, back and forth. But also he also used some sage. Got them to smudge themselves. Get comfortable with it. And eventually, it would help these people because it is then a little more cultural adaptation there to help them feel that. And then, of course, there's additional approaches to treatment. So exposure-based, I know we've talked about that, but we also need to educate them, provide education to the patient about their symptoms, typical reactions to experiencing trauma, and provide an understanding of the treatment. But if we can, we also need to do that with the family, so the family understands what's going on. Those people around them might be able to help them. We might be able to use breathing exercises to help the patients manage their breathing to cope with things. Looking at how their breath changes can occur as a result of anxiety or fear. Also, there's another way of just imaginal exposure. I'm talking about the trauma to gain control over one's reactions to thoughts about the trauma, to provide a better understanding of what was experienced. Discussing the trauma may initially be stressful, but it should lower the negative reactions over time. Because then what they're doing is that what they really see with a lot of veterans is that, and with the PTSD, is that the more they talk about the story, the more they go into that and sharing those things, the more the emotion is kind of taken out of the story. So later on it becomes the story instead of having that emotional connection to it. And a lot of times what I say is that, find somebody you can trust. It doesn't really matter if you need to talk to somebody, you need to share with somebody. But it might not even be a counselor or therapist. Find somebody you trust to be able to do so. Okay, suicide prevention plan. We're looking at, of course, crisis intervention plans. Remember, again, education is really important. Maybe of assistance in how to deal with the crisis that may come up. The rehearsal itself, if you look at even within the military, people have been in the military and say, well, what is the most important thing to a successful mission? That's rehearsal. You go through the plan, everything you do, and you rehearse it. So it's there in your mind, and you don't have to think about it when it comes. So part of helping the self is to monitor one's thoughts too, our feelings, our emotions, challenge or attempt to control them before they escalate. Coping skills can be helpful, such as meditation, getting outside, especially in nature, getting balanced again with Mother Earth. Maybe sitting upon the earth, walking in nature, distracting oneself. Exercise also helps release positive endorphins to help us feel good too. So it's important to be able to do that. Okay, so psychopharmacology, if we're looking at many times, like I think like our generation here is becoming more accepting of psychopharmacology, different medications, things like that. But usually our grandparents, they lived in another time when, like with, they had went through a lot of trauma in their lives, whether women were kind of castrated or something, in order to, they cannot have kids again. Leaders and medicine people put in, insane asylums to take them away from the people. A lot of times our ancestors looked at that and didn't trust the mental health system. And when they talked about medicines, they might have said, hey, now this isn't a medicine. What is this? Because usually with the natives, our medicine was more comprehensive of all things and how we do things, such as ceremonies and, teas or whatever it might be. We also need to remember that soldiers, especially from old school military or elite units, were taught to be tough, gaining confidence, have that esprit de corps to motivate themselves. This may occur with men, as we are taught to be tough from, our parents. Oh, be a tough guy, be a big boy, be a man. But sometimes we're not respecting, in a sense, the other parts of us. We need to be able to cry. We need to be able to share those kind of things. We need to be able to have those kind of emotions, because then it lets them out. So we need to look at that. And when we can't do those things, we need to be able to look at medication. It can be helpful. It doesn't mean that a person is weak because they're utilizing it. Consider waking up in sweats night after night, and or waking up in the dark from a dream and not knowing where you were. I mean, it's like re-traumatizing. But we need to look at that. So, but we also need to look at self-medication. That is not the answer. In the military, alcohol is pretty much a social norm, but it can cause problems. But we need to also remember that if we're self-medicating ourselves, we're also building another kind of addiction and problem that may cause us more problems down the road. Okay, so here are some medications. You look at, such as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, are a class with the strongest evidence base, with only 2 that have FDA approval. So those with treating PTSD. There are many different medications here. I'm not going to go through all these ones. I'm not here to say this is the one to do, And that's not the way that things should be done. But we need to remember that antidepressants may be beneficial, help the veteran feel normal. A note of caution, though, if a veteran starts this medication, they need to remember to stay on the medication so it helps them. A lot of times that's where kind of troubles begin. Is that they think they only need it for so long, I'm starting to feel better, I don't need this no more. They get off, and then they have more problems again. Okay, complementary and alternative medicines. So under complementary alternative medicines, this is kind of like where they place a lot of the Native American belief systems are, practices. To them are complementary alternatives. But we need to remember, with the culture, we also know that there are things that can help us. So part of this too is like they have acupuncture, relaxation techniques, meditation. Also remember that When I got out, I kept going to medicine people, but there was one that finally I went to, and he said, the spirits are telling me you need to be able to learn how to meditate. And I was like, what? Like, was meditation part of our ways a long time ago? And they said, well, yes, but we didn't call it that back then. Back then, we would sit upon the earth or some might have had called it fasting. You're going for a dream or a vision. You're sitting upon the earth. But during that time, you're also connecting to the earth. You're also feeling that connection and getting further in there. But at the same time, it helps you to balance yourself inside and out. I'm not sure what's going on. I'll just hold this microphone for a little bit. Okay, so inclusion of family and community. Ray, would you like to take this?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. In the fourth objective, our purpose for this one is to go through and describe how veterans experience a lot of some good, some bad, and supportive roles family have and community have in a veteran's experience. So we, as Native people, we're very much in touch with the value of family in all of our lives, and this is particularly true with veterans. We fully understand and appreciate, especially with tribes that have real large extended family systems, for example, like clans and where families are very large, tend to be hundreds of people, if not thousands. So the concept of family is important to understand from the veteran's perspective. Are they nuclear family oriented or extended family oriented, as most tribal people are? But we also have veteran Native families who are from urban centers. They tend to have smaller extended families of more of like a nuclear family base. And it's important for us to understand that for Native veterans especially, that family members being involved and participating in the therapy and education of family members is really, really important towards understanding the veteran's traumatic experience and their treatment. The second area in here is around community. We are, as a people, very community oriented in our grounding, in our teachings, through our teachings and through our learning, and a lot of times how we interact with each other. And in this part, it's important to realize how veterans' reintegration into the broader community, which also tends to be in many cases extended family, how that is going and some of the challenges that they may be experiencing, and support systems that exist within the community, informal support systems that exist in that community that could be helpful, and how the veterans' ability to attend to their care and ceremony is valuable to work with. Transportation, we keep hearing, is a major barrier for veterans who are in rural areas. There are some veterans it's not uncommon for veterans to have to travel 3 or 4 hours to get to treatment for their disability or to get their needs met, or even to get a physical done through the VA. And so it also makes it difficult to sustain contact or make contact with veterans when they are after they've been discharged and haven't returned back to the communities. Sean mentioned the core earlier. Veterans in the military, you get a really deep appreciation for your brothers and sisters and your comrades, and it's really strong relationships that are maintained after discharge. A lot of us still have contact with people that we served with 10, 20, 30 years ago. And those relationships are important because they end up being supportive. And when talking to a veteran and family and community, it's valuable to realize where that veteran's military support system is after discharge. And wives, spouses, and children can be encouraged to provide support and knowledge around that. Let's see, peer support. And this kind of varies. There are organizations like VFW, American Forward Legion, which really are peer support organizations. There are some places in Native country where we have peer support systems organized by tribe or by community. And these are peer support systems that can be very valuable towards bringing together veterans, newly discharged or long-time discharged people together and be able to do things that are they have interest in, like maybe community projects or working together to get through the VA paperwork system. So, developing that peer support system is really valuable. And the challenge around doing that is that some veterans tend to isolate themselves after discharge, and they end up being really difficult to contact or find. So it takes a little bit of work, a lot of outreach to be able to get the peer support process going sometimes. John mentioned Esprit De Corps, which is allowing veterans to re-involve themselves and practices. It's more and more we're seeing the development of honor guards, for example, or motorcycle clubs that are organized by veterans to really get themselves involved in things like that. And camaraderie is an important aspect of returning to a community. There are friends and buddies in communities that can develop a buddy system with, or teams, and be able to reintegrate through these informal organizations, especially back into the community, and be able to pick up a life that is not as isolated and more supportive. Tribes, of course, have an important role in being a resource and partner of care. We know that some tribes have set up their own veterans programs as a way to reach out to veterans and provide some basic services to be able to transition them into the kind of support and care they can get through Veterans Administration, especially. Some tribes actually fund veterans groups as a way to develop camaraderie and a way to enhance esprit de corps among veterans that are returning. So there's a lot of different ways to do that. Some tribes provide resources to veterans so that they can rebuild homes or pay for energy needs and gas, heating, things like that. So there's a lot of quite a few frameworks out there that are available for tribes to be able to partner up with the veteran, especially in their communities, around reintegrating into the community and healing from the experience of being in the military. So we have, it's important to realize that there's a lot that can be missed in the discussion of PTSD, and there's no magic pill towards 100% recovery. That's an important thing to recognize. Everybody heals in different ways. Some people take longer, some people may not take longer. You basically have to take a lot of tools out of your therapeutic bag to be able to really hone in on a strong approach towards helping veterans after they've returned home. And from here, we're going to get into Module 4, which deals with traditional beliefs and healing practices. This is Module 4 of 5. And what we have been working on creating in the Healing the Returning Warrior is creating some objectives around this. We have 4 objectives for Module 4. One is a discussion on cultural assessment. Second is considering traditional beliefs. Third is a discussion on traditional healing practices. And the fourth objective is around traditional, non-traditional approaches towards traditional healing. For Objective 1, why culture and assessment? Well, it's important to discuss how Native Americans view culture as important in living and healing. I think this is something that the audience today can really resonate to. We understand this is valuable to us. With our Native partners, especially and helpers, it's valuable to understand culture. Have a way to assess culture, because all our cultures are different across the 570 or so tribes we have in the United States alone, not including the tribes that are coming into the country from South America and Central America, and the Hawaiian people and the Pacific Islander people. They have cultural ways that are unique to them, and there's a lot of variation in that. So cultural assessment is important. And there are some formal cultural assessment tools that are available to us to be able to look at. And when we talk about culture and when we talk about acculturation, acculturation is basically looked at in terms of that graph you see down the bottom. Is an individual traditionally oriented in their culture, which means the language and carry some of the healing practices and have exposure to that and rely on that as a way to sustain themselves, or is a Native veteran is well assimilated into the American way, particularly those that are coming from urban centers. And then we have a lot of our people who are bicultural. They kind of move towards traditionalism and move towards being non-traditional. And that's the way Native society is today. So interculturation is valuable to have an appreciation of where that individual is and how wide their biculturalism is in their life. Some acculturation assessments, like the Native American Acculturation Scale, which can be used as a way to have a more structured way of looking at acculturation. It looks at it as language, identity of self, parents, ethnicity, cultural preferences, and community participation. Those are some of the things that are looked at in this particular scale. Tribal, cultural, and spiritual assessment. Not only is it valuable to look at culture, but also at spirituality. A good portion of our people don't practice or have involvement in the Judeo-Christian approaches, and so we have cultural assessments, like I mentioned. We look at ethnic identity, we look at ethnic self-esteem, we look at our special knowledge around traditional stories, our ceremonial songs, our dances that are there, our traditional ceremonial ways, and the herbs and medicines that we have access to. Those are things that are available to inquire about when doing a spiritual assessment. There are some culturally specific assessment instruments available to clinicians and practitioners. And here's a list of 5 of them, like the Native American Identity Assessment and the Grief Assessment, which is an interesting tool to look at. Here are some, some sample identity assessment questions that we'd like to give you so you can have an idea of how some of these questions can be framed and how they can be approached. I'd like to, way down at the bottom on the right side is a question: have you ever experienced prejudice from tribal members? Some people will look at that and think, well, that's a surprising kind of question, but it's not unusual for tribal members to be prejudiced, to express prejudice behavior and words towards other tribal members, and also from non-tribal members in particular. So these are the kind of questions that can be available and when doing an assessment of identity. Now we get on to objective 2. Now I'll ask Sean to take over from here. Okay, thank you.
Wrong button. Okay, so here we're kind of looking more at the to look at considered traditional beliefs and practices. So here, if you're looking at this, it's kind of like a medicine wheel. It's also 4 directions, 7 directions, circle of life, depending upon how people see it. We want it to be more kind of encompassing of many different tribes than just certain ones. So in a way, we're trying to do that here, but remember, it's like wherever we go to, it's like, with the colors within the medicine wheel, there's always kind of changes all wherever we go. So we kind of put a rainbow thing in each one so that people could actually take those colors and put them in there where they like. But there's many ways of looking at this as well, is that, there's body, the emotions, the mind, the spirit. There's also, within this, the directions that animals or plants may be in. It could be a circle of teaching, where maybe part of this might be from one lifetime all the way around and go back home. Or it could be part of it, like different teachings that go around and around, so maybe going around this circle more than one time, depending upon how you see this medicine wheel and how that your teachings go, because there's a lot of differences out there. Okay, so consider traditional beliefs and practices. So this was talking about, well, traditionally, when warriors went to battle, they would undergo war ceremonies before and afterwards. They would go with a prayer. People come together and pray for them before they leave and when they come back. Sometimes they were given things that would protect them. Sometimes they would be able to have, maybe they take a medicine bag with them or something like that to keep them safe. But part of 2 is like story of coming home from battle like long ago. So a person had been to battle, they'd been to war, whether it was present or long before, but when they came back, they didn't come right into the village. They didn't come right into amongst the people. The elders and stuff would meet them maybe like in the woods or maybe somewhere, so they didn't come straight into the tribe, because we need to look at what they're carrying with them. So they would go through the ceremonies, go through the healing, different things that they need out there. And once they're ready to come back into the community, of course, then you don't have a lot of people all around you. You have these trusted ones and stuff that you learn to be able to work with. And you kind of integrate into the community. So, the longer a soldier, the longer somebody is gone from their tribe or community, the harder it is for them to integrate. But also, they may be carrying other things with them that have happened to them within battle. You know, some of these might be talk about like ghosts that are connected to them, things that have gone on with them, that attach to them. So we're also looking here, looking at the red road approach. Depending upon how you look at this, there are different ways of seeing the red road. It's like this is a life. We walk this life in our lifetime. We walk this good road to be able to do as good as we can in all different areas wherever we go. The way that I was taught about it is like this road is actually around the medicine wheel. So we're trying to do all these things and walk really well, walk really good, but along the way we're also going through all these other challenges, you know, that these grandmothers and grandfathers of the four directions want us to learn, to help us to move forward and to evolve or get better in our lifetime. Also, we look at that as one's life's path. But we also need to remember that we don't all have the same path, in a sense. Sometimes what they say is that on this path in life, we meet an intersection. So there's one where most people go, and there's one where a few go. So you can tell by the way the road is worn, you know, the way of the people is this great big path. The way of certain people is this way. But in a sense, it depends on what you came here for in this lifetime. But also, are you willing to follow these older, harder ways? Are you a leader or are you a follower? Will you use this well-used path or one that's worn or less traveled? So there's also what they say is another road, and that when they come to this intersection or somewhere along this road, another road will appear to them. Now these are normally for, you know, like medicine people or certain people that this is made for. They wait, they don't know which way to take, and this road presents itself. It's not always there, so they go through, and they learn all these different things with medicines, and might be learning about the past, the present, the future, how these all intertwine. They'll learn the wisdom and things within what's going on, not with just us, but around the world and everything else. So, also looking at traditional healing practices, you know, there's a difference between, since medicine or spirituality. We look at traditions. Those are like old things to us. But medicine is also something that's encompasses everything. You know, the way we do things physically and spiritually. The keys we the way we walk, different things in our lifetime. But spirituality to us is like more of the spiritual beings that are out there that might either help us or something. Ancestors. Looking at both of these as a way of life too. Not just traditional, but also a medicine way, a spiritual way. Remember that learning about the creation is essential to finding out who we are. People either can get gifts, either earned or they're given for a reason, but we need to make sure that we utilize those. And the way I've been taught is that we don't pick our medicines, the medicines pick us. So as we go on, these kind of notice us and said, oh, this would be good for this person. But also learning teachings. Many people don't always want to learn teachings. Oh, history, all these things again, but I want to get to the good stuff. But in reality, it's like the teachings are really essential to understanding how things work, how healing and spiritual medicine's way work to make it stronger. Connection to the Creator through these medicines or spirits is essential to healing. All of creation has a spirit, which is dependent upon the rest. So we need to look at that, both our physical world and our spiritual world are connected, and we need to be able to walk good in both ways. Ray, would you like to go on with this one?
Take on objective 4 or 3. In objective 3, the purpose for this one is to begin this discussion on how traditional healing practices with veterans can be healing. I think this is well understood by many people, but it's important to have a dialogue on this also. So, traditional healing approaches. One of the impacts of trauma is that it takes people out of the circle. Healing brings them back in. The experience of war does have a significant potential to harm the spiritual health of Native veterans. And as we mentioned before, it's very important to consider how a veteran's culture can have impact on what and how they experience the trauma. It is common for Native people in the military to go through tribal ceremonies as they're in the military, and to have them be resilient and to be able to deal with the trauma experiences more effectively. Then, traditional healing practices, well, we are aware that many Alaska Native veterans prefer traditional healing practices over the American approaches to recover from trauma. And this tends to be the case across many mental health conditions that exist in our world, and that these practices can be included, as Sean mentioned, herbal remedies, purification ceremonies, sweats, dream interpretations, and rituals, as well as ceremonies and prayer. One of the challenges that happens is that all tribes share similar, if not same, healing practices. In the work that some of us are fortunate in doing and be able to experience and be able to travel to other tribal lands and see how other tribes practice their ceremonies, it is very evident that many of our ways are different. How one tribe does a tobacco ceremony is different from how another tribe does a tobacco ceremony, let alone the herbal tobaccos that are used, and which family or social relations are involved in those ceremonies. So these are valuable things to keep reminding ourselves so that we can be appropriate to Native veterans as they come to us, particularly the multicultural settings that many of us are working in. Some practices listed here that I think most of you are probably aware of. We have people who are clairvoyant, some they call empathic people. We have interpreters, we have hand healers, the whole array of ways that healing practices are conducted. Massage, traditionally many tribes had ways of massaging that are that were used. Well, the ceremonies are there helpful towards helping us and veterans in particular be able to confront fears that we experience or fears that we have. Some tribes fasting for up to 4 days is a way to become resilient, be able to become less fearful. And these ceremonies are always guided by a medicine person who has gained knowledge and has gained experience and has been accepted as a healer in that particular ceremony that way. There was a time when warriors would enter any battle or circumstance of violence and go through ceremony before and then after as a way to be that warrior. Dreams, well, not all dreams are dreams. The natives can appreciate that. Have dreams that have meaning to us. And that's a valuable thing to, as a clinician, working with a Native American who begins, we need to be able to understand that discussion and the way that the veteran is interpreting that dream is valuable to that person. Yeah, we need to understand that and appreciate that and work with that veteran on understanding their dreams a lot more appropriately, a lot more effectively, and also in a healing way. Sweat lodges or healing lodges. There are also some that's a distinction to have. To be able to understand which practice a sweat lodge and be sensitive to that cultural norm that exists for some tribes. Also understand which tribes put a heavy reliance on the sweat lodge as a way to heal and a way to recover and to purify themselves. These are valuable distinctions to appreciate when working with Native Americans. There are some tribes that actually traditionally ban use of sweat lodges or have their own ways of doing sweat lodge. Once again, dreams are ways of doing dream analysis, through psychoanalysis. That's okay. There are cultural differences in how we view dreams and how we interpret dreams in particular. They have different meanings to different tribes. Fasting is another practice that is real common with some tribes and also not common with other tribes. And in doing an acculturation assessment, it's important to understand and appreciate the role of fasting with a Native veteran who's with us. And fasting is a practice that is traditionally done to be able to understand how that is and the processes that are involved with it. And for the last objective here, we'll go ahead and switch it back to Sean. Thank you.
Okay, so now we'll get back into this here. So what is considered traditional? This can be a little bit different between who's answering that. Traditions to Native might be very far from others. It can be very different. What does tradition mean to you? Type that answer if you could now, if you would, and however many you want to. What does tradition mean to you? Both natives and non-natives. But as I'll go on and keep talking, but please let me know what tradition means to you. I'll go on a little bit as you go. We'll come to traditions in the WH later, so a little bit different here. Okay, so in assisting clients, we need to look at that, understand the culture. But as we know, culture has been being brought up a lot lately, as well as spirituality, not just religion, race, or ethnic background. With these respects, we will discuss more in time later on, but traditional ways in healing that may assist natives if they prefer them, instead or added to mainstream interventions and treatments. So looking at healing sense, there's stories of various healings in which trauma was experienced. So if we're looking at stories of trauma, I had been working with this medicine man. After I'd been working with the medicine man, helping myself, later on I stayed longer to be able to help him back, and help him with these things. But we were sitting there, and I'd noticed some things that were happening that I didn't realize in the beginning. Was that when he worked on certain people, mostly women, he would heal them in a certain area. It was like by their belly button. And I used to think, I noticed you do this more with women than you do with men. What is going on there? He's like, he goes, oh yeah. He goes, well, within what I see here is these dark areas that need to be cleaned out. And I know some of these women have told me, but I do realize, without them telling me, I know that they have gone through more like sexual attacks. Like, and some of these things is what's happening within the military today with women. So it could be some kind of sexual violence or rape or something like that. But he's talking to me about this, and he sees this dark spot, but there's other spots too. If you look at your forehead, in a sense, you would look at that and say, there's sometimes the darkness collects here. They would kind of point to where the chest is. He said some of it collects here. And then by the belly button, he said some are here. But with the head, it's thoughts. By the heart, it's feelings. And by the belly button is emotions. So when we hold that pain there, holding this hurt within ourselves, it's like we have a tendency to hurt ourselves because we're stuffing that pain, stuffing that illness or whatever back into us without letting it go. That's the importance of talking about things as well. But also the medicine man had a way of bringing that out so later on it wouldn't turn into a sickness itself. So with studies, let's do a study. It's talking about what's called Healing the Warrior. There was admissions of 2 American Indian War veterans, cohort groups, specialized inpatient PTSD unit. Now, with this, what they realized was that when they were helping everybody and giving them the same treatment, not everybody liked it. And they kind of had to adapt along the way. So they found out that they needed to take these traditional natives, give them their own treatment, in a sense. But they also had non-traditionals, like maybe they didn't grow up that way, didn't want that, they didn't trust that. So they had a different treatment. At times they did the same stuff, but there was at different times they were given a chance. Some could go to church, but the others would maybe have a sweat lodge or have medicine men come in and help them. But they added more traditional things to it. And these began to help them a lot. They realized how this adding this culture with these traditionals really brought about a lot more change. Actually, within there, these people who were doing this study actually began to participate in these ceremonies with these ones, and they really built a good relationship. And when it was over, they realized that they were actually felt more close to these clients than the non-traditionals with the people they worked with. But part of this, what they found out was that the sweat lodge really helped veterans, and that also these ceremonial ways or religion to add in there helps them as well. So again, this part talks about medicine versus medication. So we look at older generations or traditional peoples, they might not want to use medication, but prefer traditional medicine, healing, or herbs. So some medicine peoples do not believe in using medications, though, as they can be considered the reason why people are not getting better or even die due to them. Medicine is what we may consider from the old or spirit creation or natural. Medication is what we consider new. Some call it the white man's way or of science, man-made, that only brings more problems. But there's also good things about them. When everybody would ask me, it's like, what do you say? Well, the medicine people I've ever worked with, and these are the best ones I've ever worked with, they said, use both. We control, in a sense, take charge of how we treat them. But it's up to the doctors whether they want to lower these medications or raise them as well. But as we help them, sometimes what happens is their medication is lowered on that side anyway. So we need to kind of take into account that there are different medicine people have different belief systems, but you always kind of go the safe way about it. Okay, so here's what we're talking about. Well, actually, it's like, what does tradition mean to you? Now, this is from the actual WHO. So traditional, the way that they see it is modern, like what is mostly going on today. To a lot of the natives, traditional is something old. It's where the old magic was, the old power. But the WHO sees ours as non-traditional. We're kind of fall under alternative medicine, homeopathic medicine, complementary medicine, broad set of health practices, not part of that country's own tradition. So, but in a sense, if you look at those definitions, they don't really totally go with indigenous peoples. Because we see things as old, and the way we see like medicine is something very old, something that's part of everything within life. We never had to do any studies or anything like that. So we went through, our medicine people would get those knowledge and stuff from the spirits to help us. So there's also different ways of life. Again, and we, like you mentioned before, there's like spiritual way and medicine way. So there's a lot of different ways. Like the medicine way is usually more like how medicine people walk, how their lives are. So this here we go into is actually part of the follow-up, in a sense, what we go through, we're doing. So the National American Indian Alaskan Native Mental Health, TTC, can do introductory presentations with tribal leaders or providers of veterans, Native veterans wellness curriculum. National, we can also adapt the veteran wellness curriculum to be tribally specific for certain tribes, their providers, and tribal veterans. We can provide local trainings with tribal co-trainers that can be up to 2 to 3 days. We can also do trainer of trainers. That's what more trainers to be able to go through and train in other areas where they will adapt it more to their own cultural areas, so it's more specific When we did this with the pilot, we had healers, people from all around the United States, so that we can get more knowledge about this, so that we can see the differences, because there was a lot. So that's something that we wanted to kind of bring up. But if there's any questions, we can take those now.
And while you guys are typing in your questions, this is Megan again.
Sean, this is
and just to let everybody know that we are hosting a Healing the Returning Warrior follow-up learning collaborative next Tuesday, 1 o'clock Central Time, and we're going to do this via Zoom. So we would like the content to go over the first 3 presentations we've done in the webinar series, which is historical overview of natives in warfare and the military, assessment and treatment, and then traditional beliefs and healing practices. So we'll have a recap, we'll have questions, discussion, how to implement some of these tactics, training opportunities, resources that are available, and some feedback. So if anybody's interested in doing this next Tuesday, if you just contact me, megan-dotson@uiowa.edu. It's on our website. The announcement's up there on the front page. If you go to mhttcnetwork.org/native, you can get all the information I'm telling you right now. So, I'm going to turn it back to the questions if you see any coming up. Otherwise, we'll be done in about 1:30. Thanks, guys.
Mm-hmm. I want to take this time to thank everyone for joining us today at the webinar. We have another session. We have, as I mentioned earlier, we have 5 modules developed. The 5th module, Healing the Healer, we'll be going through that the 2nd Wednesday of March. So we have other webinars planned. Then in April, the 2nd Wednesday in April, we have a webinar scheduled on trauma, veterans of trauma. So looking ahead, I'm going to take this time to put out those dates as possible opportunities for everyone on the webinar and anyone else to jump in on and join us. Send an email to Megan to access the other webinars that I guess Larita Bradford is asking.
All the other webinars are on our website. If you go to the address that I just typed in there, there's a little YouTube icon on the home page, and you can look at all of our past webinars that have been recorded through those means.
Anyone have questions? We have a few minutes to entertain questions here. I'm not seeing any questions showing up.
While we're waiting for some questions to come up, I'll just remind everyone that we will be sending out a follow-up email, which will include the handouts of the slides and the CEU request form, the link to the survey, and the link to the recording in case you want to view it again or share it. for all of you who are sharing your email addresses in the chat. We will add those to the listserv so you can get notifications in the future.
And let me also take this time to reiterate some of the follow-up points that Sean described. We are available to go to tribal communities or local conferences or seminars and do a short talk, like an hour to 2 hours, even half a day, on the Healing the Native Warrior curricula or modules that we went through. So want to make sure that you all have that opportunity to access the time that we have available. And if you do have something locally that you would like us to join, it's all no cost to you. If you decide to invite Sean and I to your area, Portland or Minneapolis, wherever it is, and it comes under the auspices of a training technical assistance contract that we have. So it is basically a free presentation if you decide to seek our time to describe these modules of this curricula to a local community that you're part of or an organization that you're part of. Okay?
Yes, if you'd like to hear the whole thing, it's going to take at least 2 days, 2 to 3 days. What we have here is just a little bit of what is actually on there.
Okay, guys. Well, I think that's it for today. I don't see anybody else typing. So, Sean, Ray, thank you for doing this so much. And we got everybody's emails on the list there. So maybe we'll see some of you back on the 18th of February at 1 p.m. Central Time. Please do let me know if you need the Zoom link to join us. Appreciate your time today. Looks like Sean is going to say a comment, and then we'll be done.